Hello everyone! Welcome to this additional little video series on how to use Blender. At this point, you might have watched the Blender 2.8 Fundamentals series, which goes over a lot of Blender's basic features. But as a newcomer to Blender, or 3D art in general, it's one thing to know all the features of a software and another to use them in practice. In the following videos, I will show you how to apply this knowledge to create a simple character of your own in Blender 2.8 or 2.9. There will be some additional features and techniques across these videos, but the goal is really to stick to what is shown in the Fundamental series. Just like the outline of those videos, we will start with modeling, then go on to shading and texturing, and finally start with lighting and rendering our final result. I will regularly show the videos on screen to check out where you can get more info on the features themselves. This way, I won't really have to repeat much of the fundamental lessons that were already shown. So let's just jump right in. So first off, we open Blender, of course, and I won't really go over the basic navigation and the interface of Blender. Watch the first 3 videos of the Fundamental series for that. To create our character, we generally start with the blocking step. This step is to lay out the fundamental building blocks of what we want to create. So since we start the scene with a default cube, let's just build the character entirely around that, just for fun. From here, it's about adding primitive objects with the Add menu. Let's just add another cube for the face and subdivide the mesh in edit mode a little bit. From here on out, you can select and move around the vertices to form the basic face shape. Use X-Mirror and X-Ray, which you can find in the header, to help you out with this step. You can also use a cube to add the wings and adjust the form in the same way. A plane is all you need for the tail feather, cylinders for the feet and legs. You can also redefine the origin of an object in the right-click context menu to rotate these cylinders around a different point. This will make angling the leg joints a bit easier. Right now, the character is kind of intersecting with the ground level, so moving it up a little bit is a good idea to make it really stand on the 0 point of the world. Now we have everything laid out, but it's still only one side. In the fundamentals, the modifiers were briefly mentioned, but barely used. Modifiers are an alternative way of modeling to the usual modeling manually and destructively in edit mode. Since modifiers are only really part of the mesh once you apply them, it's very easy to make changes at any point and keep the original mesh intact. As an example, let's delete one side of the face and add a mirror modifier in the modifier tab. This will mirror the geometry using a set axis across the origin point of the object. Of course, if you move your vertices around, it might still move onto the other side and not properly merge at the center anymore. For this, you can enable the option clipping, which will make geometry stick to the center. But be careful not to accidentally clip vertices, or you will have to disable clipping again to make them unstuck. The other most essential modifier is the subdivision surface modifier, or subdiv in short. This divides your object and smooths the result to add more detail and definition. If your viewport is ever getting too slow because of all the divisions, there are separate sliders for the render and the viewport divisions. The optimal display toggle is also removing all of the new divisions from the wireframes to give a smooth and optimized view of your model. Using this modifier as a preview in edit mode, you can then easily define a smooth shape with a fraction of the geometry. Adding the mirror modifier to the wing Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work in this case unless we change the origin and the rotation of the object so that it mirrors everything perfectly across to the other side. But there is a trick. You can assign a mirror object, which will then be used as the origin to mirror from. So you can click on the color picker icon and pick the cube in the center, and the wing will appear on the other side of the cube. Repeat this process for the other objects and try the other modifiers if you want and experiment. With all of these new objects, it's time to organize the file a little bit. I'll move the light and the camera into a new collection and exclude it for now. You can also rename the objects and collections however much you want. Now it's time to model the object further. In my case, I'll continue to define the face. Switch over to Edit mode and use the Loop Cut tool or the shortcut Ctrl-R for adding extra loops, for refining the shapes and adding more geometry to push around. Because of the subdiv modifier, the closer geometry gets, the more it will pinch and essentially prevent this average smoothing. Grab, rotate, and scale the mesh to resemble the general form you want to go for. You can also press G twice to slide vertices and edges along instead of freely moving them. By selecting and extruding some faces, we can create a nose and beak area. If you slide the upper edge fully into one side, you can merge these vertices by distance by using the M menu. The eyes were so far missing, so I'll add them as spheres as well. For some extra definition, add more objects and extrude some areas like eye sockets and the beak. Moving on to the cube itself, we can add just a little bit more definition by using the bevel tool or the shortcut Ctrl-B. Using that on all the edges, we can add a bit of a beveled curve to catch some light and make it a bit smoother. But once we add the subdiv modifier, it would again smooth and distribute the loops a bit more evenly. To prevent that and make it a bit more crisp around the edges, we can add some extra loops. For the other objects, it's pretty much the same thing. Define the shapes further and add more loops. The mirror modifier is your friend. Extrude for thickness. Then add a subdiv modifier for smoothing. Then add some more loops for sharper edges. You can even stack more modifiers on top. As an example, duplicate and transform the tail feather. Add another mirror modifier to the new feather and define the middle feather as the mirror object to automatically mirror the feather to the other side as well. So in this case, we have two mirror modifiers that do different things on one object. Keep duplicating the feathers to make a little bunch of tail feathers. Using the modifiers like this makes changing things really easy and fast, while keeping the original mesh intact. Continue like this for the other objects and also try out the other tools in the toolbar and also the other operators in the menus in the header, and just experiment. Once you're done, you can apply some of the modifiers if you want, or just directly continue with shading. Like mentioned in the fundamentals, make use of the workspaces and move on to the shading workspace. This will immediately give you a way better work environment for this task. Add new materials and assign them to the different objects. You can then define base colors for rendering and viewport colors for the default solid view in Workbench. You can also just copy colors and values by using Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V over them. There are a bunch of sliders on the default material, but you don't really need to worry about most of them. I'll explain some of the most basic ones. So essentially, specularity is how shiny the material is. Roughness is for how rough the shiny highlights are, so you can make a surface more reflective. Metallic is to turn it into a darker metallic surface. With the basic materials added, it's time to get into preparing the UV maps. But first, switch the viewport color to texture, and it will use textures if there are any available in the material. Create a grid or color grid texture in the material to see stretching in the viewport of the UVs. As long as the texture node is highlighted as active and plugged in, it should work for both material preview and just textured workbench view. Copy the texture node to the other materials to see it on all of them. Now you should probably see that the UV maps could use some work. In the UV editing workspace, we can then continue with this task. The reason why the grid is visible at all is because the objects come with some pre-made UV maps when created. But due to all the modeling we just did, the UVs will be stretched and some parts might be missing UVs. To fix that, we can place seams and unwrap each object again. Once all are unwrapped, select all objects, go into edit mode, and use average island scale to make them all the same size, and then pack UV islands to average them within that 1-to-1 UV space automatically. You can adjust the placement and size of the UV islands further to maximize the amount of space that is used for the texture. To finish off the materials, we can add some procedural textures like shown in the fundamentals, or we can just paint on the model instead. You can then replace the grid texture that we made with a new blank texture, which can then be used to continue painting on. Just make sure it's plugged into the base color so you can see it in the material preview mode. So let's just move on to the texture paint workspace. In texture paint mode, use the fill tool to fill an object with one color. You can just directly copy the colors from the material. I can also really recommend, once you start painting, to go into the options on the top and set the bleed option to a minimum of 6 pixels. This means it will expand the painted colors past the UV islands for 6 extra pixels, which might avoid visible seams later on. A color palette in the sidebar can also be a really helpful way of keeping some colors around. From here, you are free to paint on the model to give the character some extra colors and detail. Of course, I can highly recommend a drawing tablet for extra precision and control. There are many different brush settings that you can experiment with, but one of the more helpful ones is changing the fall off of the brush to make the stroke softer or harder. Use X mirror again to paint on both sides at the same time. This will again use the object origin as the center for mirroring. Once you get to the painting and sculpting related tasks, I can recommend to use the trackball navigation instead of the default turntable navigation. You can find it in the preferences under navigation. It takes some time getting used to, but it allows to roll the viewport for getting different angles and just better placements of strokes. Also, with Shift S, you can enable smooth stroke, which makes the brush follow your cursor more like it's attached on a rubber band to make strokes very much more precise. As long as you're just painting on a single texture per material, you should be good to go to just paint in the usual solid workbench shading. While painting, or once you're done, don't forget to save the painted texture as a separate file, or even pack it directly into the blend file itself and save it regularly. If you should try to close Blender, it will even ask you to save the texture, so no progress is lost. To finish off the character with a nice render, move back to the shading workspace. Earlier, we excluded the lighting collection, so bring that one back since we will need the light and the camera that's in it. With the shortcut numpad 0, we can switch to the camera view, and for more intuitive positioning of a nice camera angle, you can toggle camera to view, which you can find in the sidebar, so that the camera follows the viewport navigation. Once you're happy with the camera angle, just make sure to toggle the option off again so that you don't accidentally move the camera around. For a nice, simple studio lighting environment, we can add a plane on the ground level, scale it up, and extrude and bevel the edges on the back for a smooth back wall. Just make sure to switch to smooth shading in the context menu, so you don't have to subdivide the model a lot to not be able to count the faces. In rendered mode, we can then clearly see the lighting that is coming from the one light we have right now. From here on out, set up some extra area and spotlights based on the 3-point lighting setup. I can really recommend a medium-sized warm area light as the key light, a big cold area light as the fill light, a narrow bright spotlight as the rim light, and you can even add some extra global illumination by adding a color to the world environment. The size of these lights really only defines how soft the shadows will be. The spotlight can even have a maximum distance, which is really useful. And I can really recommend to try to place the spotlights in a way that it won't shine directly on the ground and only really provides an extra rim to the character. You can even have more rim lights for extra control. You can add as many lights as you want. You can add some more color to the scene by picking a nice color for the ground to go with the character. I can also recommend to pose the character slightly by aligning some of the objects a bit differently. That extra bit of asymmetry can add a lot of appeal to the render. The painted texture can also be further mixed and adjusted with some more nodes in the shader editor. Use the render passes in the viewport to see specific information like the base color, the diffuse lighting, or just the specular highlights. This way you can fine-tune some aspects of the lighting and the render a bit further. In the output settings, you can find the usual sliders like for resolution and aspect ratio, but also extra effects in the render settings like ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, and bloom can really enhance the look of your render. Once you're done, press F12 and the final image will be rendered. But this is only one possible character. To fit the idea of this one, I created more based on primitive objects that you can add in Blender. And there are sheer endless design ideas and opportunities of what you can create. You can also take the Blender Fundamentals videos on rigging and animation and take these characters even further to the next level. And once you're ready to dive deeper into Blender, there are many more techniques and workflows out there to create art, films, games, and so much more. So I hope these videos gave you a nice first insight in how to start creating things in Blender by yourself. So have fun getting creative with Blender.